Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Johnson with the Office of International Affairs. And this morning we have an unusual treat for you. Chris Smith is Professor, Chair of Musicology, and Founding Director of the Vernacular Music Center at Texas Tech University. He's been the recipient of the TTU Alumni Association's New Faculty Award, the Professing Excellence Award, the Texas Tech President's Excellence in Teaching Award, and our own OIA's Global Vision Lifetime Achievement Award, the Bernie E. Rushing Faculty Distinguished Research Award, and the Faculty Book Award. In addition, he was elected to the TTU Teaching Academy and the TTU Institute for Inclusive Excellence. He's a fellow of TTU's Engaged and Integrated Scholars Program and the TTU Institute for Inclusive Excellence. So we're especially delighted that he has time to join us today. He's authored multiple books on various musical histories. He is producer and showrunner for the podcast Sounding History and Voices from the Vernacular Music Center. Tom Irvine is the Associate Professor in Music at the University of Southampton in the United Kingdom and a Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute, the UK's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence, where he directs the project Jazz as a social machine. Together with Chris Smith, he is writing a global history of music and its technologies from 1500 to the present. He and Smith co-present a podcast, Sounding History, which they're going to talk a little bit about today. And his most recent book is Listening to China, Sound and the Sino-Western Encounter from 1770 to 1839. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chris Smith and Tom Irvine.
Morning, everybody. Thanks very much, Michael and Reagan and the International Office, the TTU Office of International Affairs. As Michael said, I'm Tom Irvine from the University of Southampton in the UK. You can already tell that I'm actually not originally from the UK, but I've been here for 16 years, and for whatever reason, it's not really sticking in my accent, although sort of. Yeah. We're here to talk to you about our podcast, which was kindly co-funded by the Office of International Affairs. And Michael spoke of it as if it was very much in the present tense, as if we sort of present, we do, except it actually hasn't happened yet. It's going to happen. It's happening within hours. We're very close to dropping the first 2 episodes. And perhaps in the course of the hour, we can talk to you a little bit about what that's like. Even though Chris and I both come, as we'll explain, we both come from a radio background long, long ago, podcasting turns out to be an entirely different medium, and getting a podcast started is a very labor-intensive job. And so we want to thank the Office of International Affairs really at this point for your financial help in getting this off the ground, because it's been a journey. So Sounding History is a podcast about the global history of music. Actually, I'm going to stop reading from my text right now and tell you something else. This is a Zoom call, and I probably could manage it pretty well without all this stuff. But Chris and I decided to kit up for this morning to show you the tech that we actually are using to record our podcast. Normally, we would be recording on Squadcast, which is a proprietary software that allows for higher bandwidth when you're recording audio. But even so, we can work with Zoom this way. And all I have, you can't quite see it. All I have right now is I have a podcasting microphone that I bought for a modest sum off of Amazon in the middle of the beginning of the pandemic. And then I have this thing, which I will lift up if you can see it. This is an interface between my computer and the microphone. It's a Focusrite thing. I share that with my 16-year-old daughter who writes pop songs. So it's actually not a very big investment to get. That's the first point I'd like to make. Getting actually a podcast started, it's not really about investing in the microphone and the studio. Oh, and the rest of the studio, I don't know if you can see. Not really. That's pillows on my desk, okay? And I'm using those as sound baffles. And we've been working with a very with professional audio production company to do the podcast, and actually the sound in our studios has not been one of the big salient issues. There's been some problems with my microphone behavior, but that's because I'm a little out of practice. Anyway, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually talk to you. I'm going to read you the first paragraph of the script that we do every week or every episode of the podcast. So Sounding History is a podcast about the global history of music. It's a history for our time. But we want to tell our story with an unexpected twist. Our history of music is shaped around the extraction of resources from the Earth's environment, a process that reached a new intensity around 1500 of the Common Era. So profound was this change, this extraction of timber and silver, furs and coal, and so profound was its impact that many now date the beginning of humanity's role as a geologic actor with the power to change the Earth's climate to these years. We call this new era the Anthropocene. Our podcast explores how music making was shaped by the extraction and manipulation of resources from the moment the Western colonial project began, and with it, the Anthropocene. Concentrating on three core categories, labor, energy, and data, we aim to explore new layers of narrative about music on a global scale. So that's the opening of our podcast, which, as I said before, is going to drop tomorrow if Apple Music actually gets it onto their servers. If not, we're going to wait until they've finished. But that gives you an example of kind of where we're coming from intellectually. And Chris is going to take over now and talk to you a little bit about some of the other things we're going to cover today.
Okay. So one of the things, as Tom said, one of the things that we thought we would do is to try to provide sort of an intellectual take on what we're doing, but even more pragmatically, a take on how we're doing what we're doing in order to emphasize to colleagues that many of us already have most of the skills, certainly in terms of providing intellectual insight to various and diverse audiences that we've discovered, we are learning, are really essential in podcasting. To give you an idea, I'm going to share the look of the interface. This is the Squadcast interface. And then in my next slide, that's how it looks when you take out a Squadcast subscription. And then that's what it looks like. That's just a screen cap of myself. Sorry about that. And it looks rather like a Zoom situation. And if it was Tom and myself, I'd be on one side and Tom on the other. And if it was myself and Tom and others, there'd be three windows. But you can see the controls are really exceptionally simple. So I'm going to unshare now and tell you that in this presentation, then we're going to talk about how the collaborative research project began, the project that led us to the podcast. We're going to talk about the skill sets we had that we also needed to acquire. The challenges of, this will be something I think that resonates, of siloed expertise. Myself in one silo, Tom in another silo, our various universities siloing us additionally, and also ways that we can sort of work in a kind of transdisciplinary way across those silos, about very practical fiscal concerns and also career pragmatics about public-facing scholarship, and podcasting is one component of that. Shared and collaborative writing. It may be evident to you if you're watching our outlines that Tom and I are both looking at a Google Doc in which we are both actively participating. That's our running live shared script. We began our collaboration sitting across a desk from one another here in Lubbock when Tom visited me with a Google Doc open. We're now sitting across a continent and an ocean from one another, still with a Google Doc open, still reading back and forth. There's a kind of critical and methodological stance that's appeared that's impacting the writing project we're working on, because we are having to think about how to shape this intellectual content for others. We want to emphasize engagement and social responsibility. We also are very interested in engaging philosophically with the climate crisis, which Indigenous friends would not describe actually as a crisis. They would describe it as something that has occurred as long as colonialism. It's an ongoing climate emergency, which has been happening for 500 years of the Anthropocene. Also the work of public sector history, the ivory tower, the baked in systemic injustices that occur there. For our current audience, many of you may be wondering about the time and skills investment and about how to find funding allies for this kind of work. Tom already quite rightly gave a shout out to our good friends at TTU's Office of International Affairs. We have a number of other stakeholders, some of whom are actually present in this Zoom room right now. Now, as part of our own market research, we've actually developed a reasonably comprehensive grasp of podcasting's actual metrics of achievement, how you show impact, and in turn, metrics which support a kind of pro-podcast argument. And here comes the kind of cue we use in Squadcast. Tom.
I'm muted. There we go. That's a Zoom problem. You can't really mute yourself in Squadcast. I've been cued. So I'd like to start with something a little bit obvious, which is that when we put this project together, and the idea of the podcast was born in a very conventional internationalization trip I made on soft money from a grant I hold from my Turing Fellowship to visit you guys in Lubbock in the last week of February 2020 and the first days of March. So I left Lubbock on the 7th of March and arrived back after a short visit to family on the 11th of March 2020. So that was just at the very end of the so-called before times. And I think everything that we're talking about right now, like using the internet as a tool to work together, obviously was focused incredibly by the experience we've all been through in the last 18 months. So we work at public universities. Our work is supposed to be public facing, and like all of you, Chris and I are working under the expectation that we do our part to bring new and innovative research, to make that research and to disseminate it widely, and that we reach diverse audiences in new ways. And this has become even more important in the current moment. Just for an example, my university is rewriting its strategy, as universities do, and a key part of our strategy is, interestingly, more connection to our community than we've ever had before. So we call that the civic university, and there's a little bit of a British backstory to that. But podcasts, although they are a bit diffuse and could go anywhere, podcasts can play an important role in this. And the reason podcasts can do this is because they are economical. So although they are not free, and we'll talk about that, they're much less than free. They are free to use, but they're certainly not free to make, and we'll talk about that a little bit today. But they are economical, and they embody a kind of accessible portal to the world. And at the moment, podcasting is probably the fastest growing segment of the internet, the web, the World Wide Web media market. Some of you will know Serial, which is produced by This American Life, which people of Chris's and my generation know very well from its radio incarnations. But I mean, that was downloaded over 420 million times. The Happiness Lab, which is an academic product really produced out of Yale University, has been downloaded 36 million times in the past 18 months. The 10 most popular podcasts in February 2020, so right before the pandemic, included 4 that you could define as being centered on history, learning, and narrative storytelling. So crime, I don't listen to this stuff, Chris, because I guess I'm not a true crime guy, but there's Crime Junkie, the True Crime Garage, stuff you should know. Podcasts, I saw some figures just a couple of days ago in the United States. 26%, I believe, of people over 12 regularly listen to podcasts. In the UK, it's a similar proportion, and the UK, the government media watchdog did a piece of empirical research and found that people, when asked, say that they listen to podcasts and they pay attention, which is an important point, which means that enter capitalism. Podcasts are forecast to grow. Advertising for podcasts is forecast to grow considerably in the coming years. Chris?
There's a cue.
Yeah.
This is how we avoid stepping upon one another when we are improvising our conversation. I want to emphasize that this was a change in how Tom and I conceived this new medium, because we're old radio guys, and we'll tell you that story. But radio, if you're sitting in the studio talking over the microphone, has a kind of one-way dimension, unless you're in a public radio studio in Southern Indiana and someone calls you from on the studio phone late in the night. But podcasting listening, this is really significant, that 1 in 5 people consumes podcast, and that their listening is far more active and intentional.
Right. I'm going to tell you the story of a little bit about our backstory, about how we got here, and we actually do this in the pilot or the first episode of the podcast, which you can listen to. We hope very soon, within the next 12 to 72 hours. Chris and I have known each other for a very long time. He mentioned Southern Indiana. We were both students at the Indiana University School of Music in the early 1990s. Chris got there a few years before me. Chris was in jazz and musicology, and I was in classical music performance at the time. We worked together at WFIU FM 103.7 in Bloomington. That's Indiana University Public Radio. Still exists, still a terrific producer of content. And we belong to the same ecosystem, I think, of in a very large school of music that had a little bit to do with historical performance and some folk music things that Chris was doing. There was a lot of overlapping that was going on in our circles of life and experience. And then we went our way. I went to Europe to work as a musician. Chris came down there, wherever you are. And then we've come back together again after nearly 30 years, and we've known each other because in the meantime I went back to graduate school. I got a PhD in musicology, and then I got the job that I still have. And we would meet each other at these conferences, right? The academics here, well, you all know how this is, right? You go to some conference in some place, and it's all very weird because you see all these people you used to know very briefly in sort of alienating circumstances. And Chris and I kept in touch that way. And a couple of years back, after we both made our ways in our respective subfields of musicology. Now, you might think musicology must be a very tiny thing and we're all pulling on the same string, but actually, as tiny as it is, it's not the case. So Chris and I come from very, very different strands of musicology. Chris works in American music history and I work in European classical music, Western art music, and we didn't have a lot. I mean, if you'd asked us 15 years ago if we had anything in common, methodologically, we might have said no. Something's changed. So in around 2018, Chris reached out to me and said, "Do you want to do something together?" And the long and the short of it is, we didn't want to do the conventional academic thing. It might have to do with a certain what's the right word, ennui that we may have. Also, what we really wanted to do was have in our research lives, we wanted to have that feeling that we know from the classroom, right, which is engagement, which is people listening, well, usually listening to you. And we came upon the idea of doing a two-pronged project. The first prong is writing a book together, which we're doing, and the book is aimed at a more general audience. And the second prong is a podcast.
So there's a challenge here, and we are all familiar with it. We mentioned siloed expertise. Tom and I had experienced that. I went in one direction with my studies, he went with another. We teach in institutions that have some parallels, but they're also somewhat contrasted. So what we had to discover for the book project and then for the podcast were thematic ideas, concerns, which helped to both provide a through line for the book, but also that provided a kind of complementarity in our areas of intellectual engagement. And one of those things that brought us together, that crossed those silos, that created more thematic cohesion, was a sense of global history and the role of music history as a tool for doing global history and understanding what's happened globally, interculturally, and in terms of climate in the last 500 years. And there's also some pragmatic considerations as well.
Yes. So clearly, we think that having a podcast is going to raise the profile of what we're doing, which is the whole point. And having a raised profile, Chris and I have both published books with prestigious publishing companies in the academic field, peer-reviewed, those kinds of things. And those of you who are in that racket will know that when the time comes to read your royalty statement, it's a little bit deflating. And in fact, students don't believe that when you tell them how many copies of this book that you've obviously been working on for 7 years, how many copies are sold. They think, why? You just think they're thinking, why on earth are these guys even doing this? So clearly there is a pragmatic point here. When the podcast drops in a couple of days, we'll be writing to our colleagues, the commissioning editors that we're working with, our partners that we're talking to this book about, and we're obviously trying to move the dial a little bit on how the book works and whether we can leverage I'll be frank with you, whether we can leverage the podcast into making us more attractive as what they call trade book authors.
Yeah, Tom has a line which I didn't want to put in our show notes because I wanted to spring it on him. He said, in one of our first conversations, and we decided to do a book, he said, I want a book that's in the airport bookshops. Now, that's when we actually, any of us, were in airport bookshops. That was in the before times. But there's a second pragmatic reason, quasi-pragmatic reason, that shades it more into sort of the intellectual process, which is that we thought that not just the mechanics, but the thematic organization, the actual, the literal dialogue between us in creating a podcast might also put us into a more effectively accessible, outward-facing, shared and collaborative writing space. So not just the podcast as an infomercial for the book to help us sell it to an agent or to a trade press, but also the podcast to push us into a way of finding a shared narrative voice, which was truly reflective of both of us and truly differed from anything that we'd previously done.
And I also have to say that just as an academic, working on the podcast has really helped us evolve our methodological stance. And let me just illustrate that by saying how we worked. So we knew we were going to make this podcast. We reached out to a production company who we'll talk about, but then we thought, let's just start recording. Okay, so we invested in Squadcast, in the software that Chris showed you. We paid for that out of our own pockets, and we started meeting on a Friday afternoon. In England, it was a Friday morning. In the United States, during the pandemic, and I am currently on research leave, but I wasn't then. I had a very demanding administrative role, but I kept my Friday afternoons free, and we just had this hour to practice talking through parts of our book together as a duet. And we would record that and listen back to it. And it was really, really helpful. And I think it actually sped up the process compared to how we normally work.
I'm just putting something in the chat as a reminder to myself, but also for all of our listeners, all of our guests here. Please feel free to put comments and questions in the chat. We've all of us over the last 18 months learned to be sort of amateur video producers and to manage multiple streams. So I'm just dropping in the chat. Tom, tell them about the conversation about Rousseau and the crowd right after January 6th.
Yeah, it wasn't right after. It was some weeks after January 6th. And as a U.S. citizen who lives abroad, I was obviously very concerned with what had happened. And one day we were going to talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who plays a role in our work because he theorized folk music in the 18th century. And I'd done some work on Rousseau earlier in my career, and I was thinking, we have to talk about Rousseau and mobs and the crowd. And we busked, I think it's the best work we've really ever done together. Actually, I'm a big fan of this. We busked about 90 minutes of talk about January 6th in light of crowds and aesthetics. And Chris probably wants to say it's dumped into the tomorrow or never ever file, but it was really, really helpful.
It was actually very liberating. Colleagues, it was very liberating because we kind of took the conversation that we might have had in a conference hotel shortly after the assault on the Capitol and said, trying to make sense of it the way that we do through our own critical frames. We took that conversation. We were going to have a conversation about Rousseau, but we, in the midst of the Squadcast session, just as if we were in the midst of this Zoom session, we said, you know what, trash that. Let's talk about Rousseau in the crowd. And then we just went for it. It was very much, for those of you who we're both musicians, it was very much like free improvisation without a composition. So kind of tiptoeing, and it's there in the slush pile. And I suspect that our producer will pull it out at some point, maybe for our Patreon, our Prime patrons on Patreon or some such.
Okay, yeah. Sign up sheet will be shared after the meeting. Let me just move things along quickly by talking about what's going on now behind the podcast. So there's a third piece of work that we're doing together, which is that we're applying for a very large grant from a UK funder from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And that grant is about underpinning the book project, but also the podcast project and the general intellectual project over a long-term period. So for 3 years, starting next year. It's a big job, and you know how it is with grant proposals. The chance of getting them is very low, but you need to do it because you need to do it. And what that process has done for us is it made us think about even other ways we can hang the work. other hooks we can hang the work on. And we always were interested in the climate crisis, but we've become very interested, and this is quite apropos this week of COP, in this UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we've written those into the headline of the grant project. So we want to orient our work as humanities scholars to the SDGs, and that's actually quite, it turns out, that's actually quite unusual because the humanities and cultural areas are not very well, if those of you who know the SDGs, they're not very well worked out. So this has become something I didn't expect at all, to be spending a lot of time reading this kind of policy documents, but we're doing that, and that wouldn't have happened, I think, without the podcast and the way that we've been going.
Yeah, and I would take it further and say that at each stage of this, the evolution of this partnership, it was a book. Before that, we talked about a conference, we talked about an edited collection, we landed on this idea of a co-authored book, and the podcast, the idea emerged as a way to leverage the book with agents and publishers. But then, and that's what the first series of 8 episodes, which drops sometime in the next few hours, that's what it's about. But series 2, because we were called upon to expand our view and to be even more inclusive of diverse topics, to sort of turn the sounding history lens upon some shared themes which we are developing with stakeholders both in the UK at Turing, at Tom's University of Southampton, and then here at Texas Tech. And there are folks in this Zoom call today who are stakeholders with whom we are developing the series 2, which, as Tom has said, it has a through line. It's about climate. It's about integrating, from our side, from the Texas Tech side, it's about integrating undergraduate learning within those things. And podcasting has forced us to do exactly what I said at the beginning, which is to get out of the silo of single author monograph, that's our zone, right? Single author monograph. But it's also called upon us to get out of the zone of monodirectional radio presentation. And it's forced us, it's just a tired metaphor, but it's a true one. It's forced us into true conversation between ourselves and the sources, between ourselves and our other potential stakeholders.
Yeah, so apropos conversation, I see from the time that we've just about hit the half-hour mark. So maybe now is a good time to step back and take questions from people who are on the call with us. Chris and I do have another couple of pages of notes that we can work through just in case, but I suspect there might be some questions, and I'd love to hear some feedback, because actually I've never talked about the project to an academic audience before, so I'm quite curious to hear your reactions.
You can just unmute. There are few enough of us that you could just unmute and talk, or drop it in the chat. The other thing that I can do is what I might do is I'll do a bit of a share screen and just sort of to maybe precipitate conversation specifically about the mechanics. Okay, so I'm going to do a share screen, and I'm just going to take you through a few internet browser tabs. Excuse me. As I said, this is entirely about using the available podcast-specific, podcast-designed technology to do what's actually an international collaboration from a distance. So there's Squadcast, right? That's what it looks like. I can open up past sessions. It's rather like recording Zoom calls. The key thing with Squadcast is that excuse me, this is a key thing for me with podcasting, but the key thing with Squadcast is that it is designed to capture high resolution audio over the internet. It is not primarily designed to capture video. The video is there for the cueing of the conversation, which is why, like old radio guys, Tom and I can signal each other and do all of these kinds of things. But the interface is designed to capture high quality audio, and it is an industry standard. It costs us about $200 a year, a $200 annual subscription for this kind of an interface, which both records in high quality, which will do automated mix downs of the different tracks, but we'll also store them. We'll also archive them in these past sessions, as you see. Google Docs is hugely important for us, and Tom is a much better curator of Google Drive than I. But you can see the way that we kind of organize our work. I'm looking right now. I'm going to see if I can drag this window. It Zoom may or may not permit me to. I'm going to do a new share. Yeah, so here's the Google Doc, drawing the curtain back. There's the Google Doc that Tom and I are working from. And it actually looks really quite a good bit like one of our working scripts. Yep. And there are times when we say, well, we know what we want to say. We can busk it. We can improvise it, just as if you were looking at lecture notes. So to go back to my original share. Yeah, there's my original share.
Sorry, that's my daughter from college calling. I just hung up on her. It's okay.
Google Docs. We have been our wonderful podcast production company, who are also actually expat there. They're U.S. citizens, but they work from Mexico, which makes this kind of interface even more important. They have encouraged us to use the project management software called Trello, which neither one of us knew, but you can see it's a way to store, it's a shared workspace, right? This is what SeedPod uses, and they're quite adamant about it. And then we have all of the typical social media materials and strategy and support tools, all of which have to be in place before the podcast drops. And just to tell you sort of where we stand now, and again, please feel free to ask questions, colleagues, to tell you where we stand now, the recording of the conversations, much of it we did in June and July of this past summer. And it was only once those conversations, the raw tracks, were recorded, that it became very much more evident to us how much has to happen post-production in terms of audio polishing, audio editing, but also in terms of the very complex jobs of getting the materials onto the various podcast streaming services and maximizing their impact and maximizing their visibility. And that's, again, where this Trello project management software is so important. All of these cards telling us where things are, how to locate them, how to source things, how to assign tasks. I'm going to stop the share. There's a question in the
question from Brian. Can I take that, Chris?
Please.
So Brian is asking this question because he's actually seen the lineup for series 2. In series 1, we didn't have any guests, so we ran the podcast as we wanted to start from our own project, and we were also kind of unsure about whether this thing was going to fly at all. So we structured the podcasts around a conversation between the two of us with material from the book. The idea we used was there was going to be like each one of us would bring a postcard from the book manuscript that illustrated a problem we were talking about in this sort of sonic history. For season 2, we are lining up some guests, and we are I should be careful about saying, Chris, who we've lined up.
We have one of the emphases in the podcast is that this is us in conversation with one another, with historical material, with new meanings, with new interpretations of that historical material, but also in conversation with people even from beyond the humanities. So we have climate specialists lined up. We have people who are specialists in environmental concerns and in the creative response to environment. We have stakeholders who have all of these other expertise, because it's not just a podcast about music or even about music history. It's a podcast about two blokes talking, as we first described it, and engaging in new conversations, and especially two blokes talking and trying to hold space for voices, for stories, and for voices and for constituencies who have been shut out of this kind of academic discourse.
Yeah, I just want to pick up the second part of Brian's question, which I think is really interesting, which is deeper dive into the payoffs and costs of post-production. So we're working with a professional production company, and the amount of work that has to be done post-production shocked me, actually. And we're not the only academic podcast out there. There's at least 2 in my own department besides
There's
mine.
At least 1 in this room.
Yeah, and there are ways you can do podcasting using Squadcast and very basic sound engineering that you could do on your own with Audacity or something, that are much less labor intensive than what we've gone for. We're working with a production company that comes out of high-end audio documentary. So all the podcast production companies, unless they were founded by people who are very young, are former radio producers. or people who were still conditioned by radio as a medium, or by audio sound documentaries, the sort of Kitchen Sisters and This American Life thing that started around 20 years in the US. Context, British context is a little bit different, but if someone wants to know, I can explain to you about the BBC and the production companies and the commissioning rounds and all that kind of stuff. I've been surprised by how much editing's been necessary on the back end, even though I thought I was a good radio person who knew how to behave in front of a microphone. That doesn't appear to be the case. And so there are costs. There are costs involved with this. These costs are not in hundreds, they're in thousands per episode, and they need to be thought of. But I still think I recently priced a documentary film for my Jazz and Social Machine project, and it came out to £1,000 a minute for a high-end documentary film production. And podcasting is much, much less than that. So I still think that it's probably worth it.
There's another question in the chat from our friend Levi from True, and he says, could you talk a little bit about how you frame this work in the context of your broader scholarly work? How do you balance the time demands of this project against the other things you're chasing in your faculty roles? You're a man after my own heart, Levi. Do you see any of this as a compromise or sacrifice versus creating work that more traditionally contributes to service teaching scholarship? Tom, do you want to take that, or shall I launch in?
I can just say that, I find myself on research leave, and when the time comes for me to write up the report on my research leave, I'm going to have a red face, because I'm going to say, well, no, I didn't write as many 100,000 words or tens of thousands of words that I kind of boldly promised I would. I've been working in media production, but I'm not sorry about that at all. I guess one thing that, if those of you who are in management roles might want to think about, or if you know people who are in management roles, is we're going to, at universities, we're going to have to think about how do we manage promotion, and how do we manage this kind of public engagement as a thing that academics do and can get credit for.
One of our launch points for when we first started pitching this podcast idea for series one of our launch points was to say cost benefit ratio, and the degree to which this material can be infinitely and freely accessed by as wide a listenership as possible, plus the much higher levels of active engagement, people who seek out podcasts because they wish to learn something, educators who do the same thing. There's lots of support material that we have developed and that we've pitched specifically to speak to those various clienteles. What I have done, I had a research leave a year ago for a semester, and I spent my time writing about 110,000 words of first draft for my half of the book. I anticipate that Brother Tom will do something analogous to that, but the point here is that the podcast is actually facilitating that. So Levi, to your question, do you see any of this as a compromise or sacrifice versus creating work that more traditionally contributes? Well, I know how many copies of Dancing Revolution and The Creolization of American Culture I sold, and I believe that most of them were to libraries, and I believe that I can make a very persuasive argument via Google Analytics and Apple Podcasts Analytics to emphasize, okay, perhaps we've reached 15,000 active listeners instead of the 200 libraries that bought my book.
Which brings us back to the question about how, it's a question for us to manage. For those of you who work in funding academic research, also you should think about like what your university's missions are. This is something I'm really interested in breaking through with podcasts. I'll tell you out of the, I don't want to talk out of school here, but there's been some resistance at the University of Southampton, which is a large research university with a big medical school. It's very similar to TTU in its subject setup. Is that we have a dedicated office for public engagement for research, and they've been fairly resistant to the idea of podcast production as something they should fund, and they to the point that they've actually said, this is not public engagement because it doesn't involve people interacting with each other in a physical space. And of course, I had to laugh when they said that, because when I got that email, nobody was interacting with anyone in any physical spaces. But the point was, from the point of view of an organization that already has a public engagement office, what they do is large scale events for the public. And they're a little worried about podcasting because it just seems to go whoosh off into the distance, and the engagement can't be measured. So one thing that we've thought about doing is making sure that we capture that engagement, so that when it comes time for us to report to funders, our internal funders, and to apply for new funding, we can say, Not only do we know we have this many downloads, but we've got engagement on Twitter. We've got engagement on Instagram. So we spent a lot of time with Instagram in the last couple of days, I have to say. Southampton's
with our administrative assistant teaching us, and in fact, it was very charming. She made tutorials for us about how to use Instagram.
So shout out to Meg Davies, who's a master's student in international music management at the University of Southampton, former undergrad of ours, who we hired last year in her final undergraduate year on the first round of funding to be our PA and office manager, and she's been amazing. Especially in helping us think about how we're going to reach the demographic that Chris and I actually think we know because we work with them every day. But apparently it was thought we needed to have little videos about how to use Instagram, and I'm sure she's right. I can't wait to read them. I can't wait to watch them.
So, other questions in the chat or from folks participating? Brian. Brian says, by the way, I continue to learn things from my good friend, Brian Gemza. By the way, 200 libraries is a sort of threshold for a major title. How sweet it is to have 15,000 people absorbing some part of that content right from the go. Engaged scholarship at TTU will be very interested in the recording of this session, especially in the wake of recent conversations about TNP and the scope of outputs that constitute engaged scholarship. And Brian, thank you for that comment. And I'm going to jump off from that, pick up from that, and also make another point. We appear to be at the front, Tom and myself, unanticipatedly, without grand strategic thinking, at the front end of two waves. One, the wave of much more widespread adoption by academic institutions of podcasting as a public engagement tool. I see Jared Foster here in the Zoom room, and there are folks across the campus not only doing podcasts, but also teaching podcast production. So we're kind of part of that wave. There's a second wave that is cresting here, which is in our field of historiography and music, a very immediate and growing awareness of not only the degree to which traditional music history has shut out and silenced voices and disappeared people from the frame, musics and people and cultures from the frame, but also the way in which that silencing over 500 years is exactly coterminous with, concurrent with, and another manifestation of the age of the Anthropocene itself. The Anthropocene happens because of what happened in 500 years of human intervention. And so we are interrogating music as part of culture, as part of global community, as part of colonialism, as part of climate. So it's a big task, and I can foresee a lot of different clienteles with whom we can converse, as we've said. Other questions or comments for anybody? From anybody, for anybody? I've posted a few things in the chat. The website will not go live until the podcast itself drops, but if you want to save that, you can save that. Actually, the website is soundinghistorypodcast.com. One of the things that's really been impressed upon us is that these things have to be timed very carefully. It's easy for Tom and myself to get on the microphones and train ourselves, as we did this past summer, train ourselves how to have a conversation in this new medium. For myself, speaking for myself, a much steeper learning curve has been all the stuff that has to happen post-recording. We're both worked in studios a lot. We're both working musicians and have been active recording artists. So we know that, but it's everything that has to happen after, both in terms of the audio production, but even more, the pretty extensive administrative jobs that need to be done. And that's one of the reasons why we have sought partners who can in turn help us fund administrative assistance. Yeah.
So I don't think that universities, as they're currently, and I'm ready to be corrected. I don't work at a university with a journalism or communications school, so I imagine it could be different. But universities in general, it seems to me, are not quite set up for this kind of work. Not for any negligence, but because simply there isn't an understanding of the medium throughout the support colleagues who usually do this kind of thing. So we've got great press people at Southampton whose job is to do press for us, but they don't really know the kind of things that you would need to know to be running a podcast production company. And I'm a little bit, I'll put a little anecdote out. I won't name any names, but I'll put a little anecdote out there to show you that if we don't do this, someone else is going to do it for us. And And I recently was speaking to an acquaintance of mine who works in climate, in the climate space, in the climate sector. He's a venture capitalist, so he works for an organization in that invests in green technology. And unsurprisingly, although the situation of the climate is not so hot, the bottom line of his firm is pretty good at the moment, because there's a lot of subsidy out there and there's a lot of demand for this. And he mentioned to me that his firm was staking a podcast company. I said, "Oh, that's really interesting. Like a an investment fund, a venture capital fund, staking a podcast company." And I said, "So what do you expect to make out of that?" And he said, "Well, we don't really know. We don't expect a big return on a big financial return, but we want to create really good work in this space that gets information about the climate crisis out of the public domain." And so then I asked him, I said, "Do you mind me asking how much money you're staking them with?" And he said $1.5 million. And I just, I fell off sideways, because I'd spent a lot of time writing grant proposals for £3,950 or something like that, And so I think that in universities, we need to realize we are the generators of stories. They're not just about the climate. What we do is we create stories about everything. And universities would be well advised, I think, to think about this medium as a way to amplify those stories, especially because, and I come from a publicly funded university just as you do, we have a job to do in the public space, right? In the public square, to make a case for what we're doing. And this would be a way to do that.
Yeah, I would absolutely concur with that. As someone who has become really a very avid podcast consumer in about the last 4 years or so, I will say that I am not aware of I'm not aware of any sort of, let's say, popular media which is not also backed up by a podcast. And I think that major media companies and also major academic and trade publishers are generating podcasts for the same reasons that Tom and I are laying out, that they find active listeners who actively seek the content. They go out and find that content, and then they listen in an active and engaged way. And that is infinitely it may be infinitely permutated. And therefore, to Levi's earlier question, it can be leveraged. The podcast can be leveraged in exceptionally economical fashion, and it then goes outward in a kind of self-propagating way. So I think universities and trade publishers, as well as popular media companies, realize that a podcast is an adjunct to whatever else you're doing that finds its own engaged audience.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a comment aimed at, because I know that we're being hosted by your Office of International Affairs, so I wanted to say a couple of words in their direction. I have a lot of time for international affairs people because I worked a long time in my own career here at Southampton in what we call internationalization. And speaking of carbon, that involved me burning crazy amounts of carbon. Because I traveled an awful lot. I ran international affairs for a big music department, one of the UK's biggest music departments for 5 years, and I was mainly in East Asia quite a lot. I can remember going. I think my record is a 4-day trip to East Asia, which is nuts, and I won't be doing that again. However, here we have an example. Good, Chris and I happen to know each other. I'm not all that international, I guess, because I'm originally from the United States. However, we do represent universities from vastly different perspectives in very different countries, and we're working together using this medium, and we're learning a lot about each other that way. And I think what's coming down the pike is opportunities for international education together on the basis of the podcast. So season 2 that we're pitching right now internally at both institutions is going to involve student involvement, student input from the very beginning, and that's going to be de facto a kind of international education around this medium. And clearly, we're not burning any carbon doing this, right? So we could take the travel budgets that we've been spending on flights, and we could spend it on podcasting, and we'd still be well, that's not how we operate, right, guys? But we'd still be quids in at the end. So there's probably actually some budgetary perspective here about rededicating money that we used to spend on unsustainable travel to this kind of work to everyone's benefit.
I'm just watching the clock here, and I think we're just about at the end of the 50-minute time. And in the world of Zoom, I know that we all need that 10 minutes to switch over to whatever is our next obligation. Are there any last comments or questions anybody wants to raise? Please feel free to email either Tom or myself. I'll put my email in the chat. Maybe Tom will put his email in the chat. Brian asked a question. Sorry, that's just Christopher. There's no apostrophe in my first name. Brian asked a question in the chat. The website is not live, and it will not just yet, and it will not go live until Series 1 actually drops, which will be confirmed. And Tom, there's Tom's email in the chat as well. In the time that we have left, I just want to really thank Michael Johnson and Reagan Raborti and the entire staff and leadership of the Office of International Affairs, because they were a core funder for my side of the necessary funding match. And I'm very, very appreciative of that continued that support, and I'm very appreciative of some of the new stakeholders that we're hoping to take on in both the UK with the Turing Institute and also here at Texas Tech. So thanks to everybody who's made it possible so far, and thanks for this forum.
Yeah, and my thanks too to everybody. It's been a pleasure. I mean, don't get me wrong. Sustainably, I do enjoy traveling. And I hope that I can come and visit you guys sustainably in again, because I did enjoy my week in Lubbock. And a week in Lubbock, or 10 days I was actually there, is already better than just coming in for the day. And in future, in what we're designing, we hope still to see each other in person, but we're not going to do it just on a quick meeting basis. And it would be remiss of me not to thank my own funders, the Faculty of Arts and Humanities Strategic Research Fund at the University of Southampton, and my Turing Fellowship, who've very kindly helped support this project as it's going forward. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for your time and your attention. I enjoyed podcasts, so I actually very much enjoyed listening to this and learning. We will have the recording for this available online as soon as we're able. And thank you so much.
It's been our pleasure. Thanks,
You're
everybody.
welcome. Thanks.
Have a day, everyone. Tom, go have a drink. It's after 5 for you.
Is it after? No, 6 minutes. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Cheers, friends. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.